Today's video is dedicated entirely to Pink Floyd. I don't really feel like I talk about them a lot, but I feel like they've been consistently one of my favorite bands ever since I was 3 years old. I often find myself revisiting the golden years of their catalog, as in Meddle Through the Wall, but a few months ago when I got the itch to dive in again, I thought it'd be a great idea to actually explore the entirety of their discography to get a better understanding of the band and how they evolved. This desire to comb through their catalog also coincided with creating a lot of Pink Floyd content, as I'm sure many people have noticed. On these videos I get tons of comments about other albums in their catalog, and many heated debates in my comment sections arguing which songs or albums are better than the others, so I figured a proper catalog sit down would help me form my own opinion of their lesser known works. I'll be focusing on the main studio albums with a couple mentions of different releases and singles here and there. I'll also showcase some riffs here and there, seeing as this is a guitar channel and I do like to show off my chops every once in a while. Let's get right into it. Yeah, it's alright. Everyone probably already knows this, but this era of Floyd is a totally different band from the Pink Floyd that we would come to know and love later on in their career. I've always seen it as an album you either love or you hate. Either it's a really neat time capsule of a certain era of Pink Floyd, or you think it sounds nothing like the golden years and therefore it's bad. Personally, I'm kinda in the middle. It has some good tracks, some okay ones, and some that are, for lack of a better word, a symptom of the era. I always see this album referred to as whimsical, so I guess when I started to get into it, I wasn't really sure what to expect as far as what that term meant musically. But now that I've heard it, I'd say it's a pretty apt description. I mean, just imagine Sgt. Pepper's, but even more psychedelic, and you get this album. Starting off with Astronomy Domine, we get one of the band's finer tracks from their early days. It's simple, and I love songs about space, so I guess it just kind of works for my brain. Also going into this video is probably the only Floyd song I knew of all the music that came before Meddle. Matilda Mother is also lovely. I think those harmonies in the chorus are really wonderful, and the main riff to Interstellar Overdrive is really cool, and it almost makes you want to cover it in a punkish fashion. That said, the sprawling, experimental jam is a bit too drawn out for me personally. I enjoy weird and experimental music, but I think it's a bit too aimless in the case of this track. Bike, along with the singles Arnold Lane and See Emily Play, are perhaps the best of Barrett-era Floyd in my opinion. They're really wonderful and catchy tunes, and I really think they encapsulate the band at its psychedelic peak. Apples and Oranges is also a neat little honorable mention here. We'll never know what could have become of a Sid-led Floyd in the 1970s, but at the same time, these choice picks I've mentioned from this one album are all I really enjoy of the whimsical psychedelia of Pink Floyd's early days. I actually really enjoyed this album. I don't think it's as great as their mid-period work, but I think it's certainly my favorite of their early days. As with many of the early albums, you have to go in with the expectation that you're not going to find a Comfortably Numb or a Money, but instead you get a song like Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun, which is a really phenomenal track. It's moody and it's low-key, and the main riff and ambient atmosphere feel like you're being enveloped in it. The intro bass line to Let There Be More Light is also great. It really opens the album strongly, and I feel like it's one of Roger's sickest bass lines. The title track, A Saucerful Of Secrets, is also extremely cool too. Yeah, it's a bit weird and heavily experimental, but it reminds me of a film soundtrack. The opening has a strange, mysterious quality that somehow feels like it's inviting you in. What does the title mean? What is the secret? Why is Roger banging a gong? The world may never know. Although I complained about the experimental noodling of Interstellar Overdrive, I do feel like it really works for this track for some reason. I think it helps to have Rick's organ a somewhat omnipresent feature of this track. That said, the Rick Wright numbers are probably the low point of the album for me. They're fine songs and all, but that's about it. I like Remember a Day a bit more than Seesaw, but I think overall Roger's tracks and the title track show a glimpse of what we would see into the future of the band, with longer track lengths and more tracks with extended instrumental sections compared to Piper. Lastly, I think Jug Band Blues is a great send-off for Sid. It's a great closer and it perfectly encapsulates him as a person and an artist at that moment in time. Before I move on, I'd like to make a quick brief mention of the B-side to a single here, the one and only Careful With That Axe Eugene. It's for the most part an instrumental, but I think it's worth mentioning because I think this track, along with tracks like Set the Controls and the title track from Saucerful, were really the impetus of the sound that Pink Floyd would eventually evolve to on later albums. This sort of moody and dark atmospheric quality really showcased the style of arrangements come to feature on tracks such as Echoes and even something like Us and Them. I will say I do prefer later live versions of Eugene featured on Ummagumma and Live at Pompeii, but nonetheless it was interesting to hear this track in its original form. When I first listened to this album, I thought, wow, it's a really great album. But upon second listen, I feel like it's not really all that great, but it does have a few cool songs on it here and there. My favorites would have to be Cymbeline, which I heard as a fan favorite, Green is the Color, and Cirrus Minor. Cymbeline is probably my favorite on the whole album. I think the lyrics perfectly fit the tone of the song, and despite its simple structure, it does sound pleasant and was a track I did return to often. Aside from those few picks, I feel like the only noteworthy tracks are the Nile song and Ibiza Bar, for being two of Pink Floyd's heaviest songs in their whole catalog. The Nile song is cool for what it is, but the more I listened to the album, the more I felt myself gravitate to the more pastoral acoustic numbers. As for the rest of the album, it's okay. The only tracks I enjoyed were Crying Song and Main Theme, but aside from those standouts I mentioned, I probably won't ever revisit the album as a whole. Look, I'm not gonna mince words here. This album is ass. It's easily the worst Pink Floyd album in my opinion. If you don't know anything about it, it's divided into some live cuts on disc 1 and original music on disc 2, which comprises of solo compositions contributed by each member of the band. It sounds interesting in theory, but if you haven't heard it, it's pretty poor on the execution. Sisyphus starts off fine, but then devolves into what sounds like Richard Wright banging his fists on a piano. Roger Waters' contributions range from fine to terrible, fine being Grantchester Meadows, and terrible of course being Several Species. As much as I'll meme this track to death, I think it's objectively awful. David Gilmour's The Narrow Ways suite is fine. It's not the greatest piece of music ever conceived, but I certainly think it holds its own, especially in the last part of the track. Lastly, Nick Mason's solo contribution, The Grand Vizier's Garden Party, despite essentially being a 7-minute drum solo, isn't bad actually. It's experimental, but I kind of actually enjoyed its ambient qualities, and was possibly my favorite of all of them, a rare win for Nick. The only thing that really redeems this album as a whole, in my opinion, are the live cuts, which are of decent audio quality and showcase the band in this era of their career. That said, you can also find like 5 other live versions of these songs through YouTube or just through the early years box set accessible through most streaming services. I will still give this album some credit for these live tracks. They are a typical good quality recording that I would expect of Pink Floyd. I have on the script Zabriskie Point, but I don't think I took the time to listen to those tracks, so we're moving on. Yeah, it's good. This album deceived me at first because for the longest time I was convinced it was bad. I think the way the title track begins with the dissonant sounds of the orchestra made it hard for me to want to sit down and give it a listen. That said, I was looking forward to revisiting this album because one of my friends from study abroad in Japan told me this was his favorite Pink Floyd album. And I really trust his music taste, so I wanted to give it a fair shot. And personally, I think it delivered. The more I listen to the title track, the more I feel like I really enjoy what it has to offer. The orchestra certainly adds an interesting element and makes the track unique, but I do feel like some parts get really dissonant in a way that doesn't quite work for me. But hey, it's still cool. I have heard a few of the orchestra-less live versions, which I also enjoy, but I think the middle, slow section suffers a bit without the choir. My favorite part has got to be the section entitled Funky Dung, which is a great funk breakdown that reminded me of the funk section and Echoes and Shine On You Crazy Diamond Part 8. I will definitely revisit the song from time to time. It certainly is a vibe and I enjoy it. As far as the remaining tracks, the formula is the same as Ummagumma, where each member wrote a solo piece that everyone performed. Honestly, I think all the way around everyone's tracks delivered compared to the last album. Rick Wright's Summer of '68 is a really solid track that's probably the easiest to get into, and then you have something like Fat Old Sun, which brings out the best in Gilmour's songwriting and guitar proficiency. That solo is just so pleasant on the ears. I wasn't a huge fan of Alan's Psychedelic Breakfast, but as far as the music parts of the track go, they were far from Pink Floyd's worst numbers. When I really started to get into music listening, I made kind of an effort to listen to the most popular album that a band had done, and then to listen to the album that came before it to hear where they came from before they made the popular album, and thus I bought a copy of Meddle after getting into Dark Side of the Moon. I know technically Obscured by Clouds came before Dark Side, but I think of it more as a side thing. Meddle is an album that I've consistently enjoyed over the years for its variety and great quality in both recording fidelity and songwriting. One of These Days is a solid opener. It's one of Pink Floyd's heavier tunes that really grasps your attention before segueing into A Pillow of Winds, which is a really beautiful track. The atmosphere it creates really invites you in, and it's kind of comforting to me. Fearless is also a solid addition to the album. Saint-Tropez isn't bad, but to me it certainly feels slightly out of place on this album and personally a bit weaker than the other tracks, but it's certainly not bad, and I welcome the jazzy contrast as opposed to the two folkier tracks that preceded it. Seamus, however, is probably one of my least favorite Pink Floyd tracks, and there's nothing anyone can say that will change my mind. I'm sure some people have seen my video on it. Echoes is, of course, miles beyond the rest of the tracks of this album, and that's not to say they're bad by any means. But there's something really special about Echoes. It almost feels like a song from ancient times that has been channeled through Pink Floyd. I don't really know how else to describe this feeling I get when I hear it. It's an absolute titan of a track. The way the song slowly creeps into view, the somber verses, the absolute bombastic funk section, the ambient and sort of frightening middle section, and the perfectly executed build into the finale. This song is fucking fantastic. It's long, sure, but I would argue the band makes every second worth it. The builds, the transitions, carefully crafting and building each idea like sonic artisans to deliver a holistically complete work. I love it all, but my two favorite sections are probably the aforementioned funk section, especially the Live at Pompeii version, which David really goes to town using his fuzz pedal, and the slow but steady build into the final verse, which feels somewhat tense but is a necessary musical bridge that completes the song. I did just mention it briefly, but I highly recommend you check out the Live at Pompeii concert that they put out around this era. It features tracks from Meddle, Saucerful Of Secrets, and also a cool rendition of Careful With That Axe Eugene. Certainly a great piece of the band's history, and just really cool to see them all in action, even if no one was actually there to witness it. I always forget this album exists, to be honest, and when I went to listen to it, my takeaway was, it's actually decent. I wouldn't say it's as great as any of the Golden Era albums by any means, but it's not really a bad album at all. Childhood's End sounds like an alternate universe Pink Floyd where they didn't create Dark Side of the Moon, but instead just made more typical 70s rock music. It's a neat little tune, and it certainly fits a mood, but I can't help but feel like it pales in comparison to Time, especially since both songs are about growing older and Roger reused the clock-ticking sound for it. It's still a cool song, though. Stay is a great Rick Wright piece, and again, very standard rock affair of its era. The structure and sound actually kind of remind me of Wild West End by Dire Straits. What's the Deal is good, and I think the title track and When You're In are nice. That said, I know Free 4 is like a fan favorite from this album, but I didn't really like it that much. My main thing about this album, aside from the tracks that I mentioned, I just feel like overall this album is not the underrated masterpiece that I hear people claim that it is. I've seen so many comments that claim that this album is as good as Wish You Were Here or Animals, and I find it really hard to agree with that, but I will say despite feeling that it's not their greatest work and it is somewhat forgotten, it still does have a few decent tunes on it. Look, I don't know what's left to say about this album that hasn't already been said. It's phenomenal. I grew up with this album. I can still remember standing in my living room at the age of 3 listening to the sax solo on Us and Them. It's a really special album to me in a nostalgic sort of way, but also a great album musically and lyrically. In my opinion, there's not a bad song on it. Breathe serves as a brilliant opener, setting the tone and mood for the album as a whole. Time is probably one of my all-time favorite Pink Floyd tracks. The older I get while listening to it, the more I understand what Roger meant when he wrote the line, "Well, you run and you run to catch up with the sun, but it's sinking." And that guitar solo. The Great Gig in the Sky is just a phenomenal instrumental that I somehow never grow tired of hearing. Rick's contribution to the track is nothing short of sheer brilliance, but sometimes I can't help but groove out on the low end on this track that Roger laid down. Us and Them tells us the various societal issues in the simplest language that's easiest for everyone to understand. And of course the pairing of Brain Damage and Eclipse serves as a fantastic end. It's just a really beautiful and introspective album that I feel is able to resonate with many people because it speaks of different aspects of the human condition. There is a lot that they were able to pack in this 43-minute span of time in terms of themes and sonics and music, and of all the albums I've heard in my life, there's not too many that I can revisit time and time again and still receive the same level of enjoyment as I did when I first heard it. And look, despite all the glazing that I'm doing of this album, you don't have to like it. There's not some stipulation in the contract of life that says you have to like Dark Side of the Moon. It's all just simply my biased opinion, but I'll be damned if I don't say it's a damn fine album. Is it my favorite? I don't really like to say I have a favorite Pink Floyd album, but I think this one certainly comes very close. I always see people say that this album is better than Dark Side, and although I'm not really sure I agree with that statement, I think it's one of their best, and some days I wake up thinking it's my favorite. Shine On You Crazy Diamond really eases you into the album, but once that 4-note arpeggio hits, it's off to the races. Both sides of Shine On I feel like are extremely good, and I especially love the slide guitar and funk sections of the latter half. The musicality and lyrics are some of Floyd's finest works, and like The Great Gig in the Sky, I never grow tired of any part of this song. I feel like especially in recent years, the lyrics hit me harder than they ever have before, whether I'm reminiscing about someone I know or even just thinking about them in relation to myself. There's still relatable even if they're so obviously about Syd Barrett. Welcome to the Machine has been consistently one of my favorite Pink Floyd tracks ever. The layer of synths and soundscapes on this track create this overwhelming atmosphere that I love. It's so cold and vicious in nature, but certainly a standout for me. The title track is one of my favorites too, and its simple but meaningful qualities have a very special place in my heart, as I remember hearing it often since I was very young. I think it's one of the few songs in the world that can make my soul feel whole while listening to it. I'll admit here and now that in my personal opinion, Have a Cigar is probably one of my least favorite tracks of the golden years of Floyd. It just seems like leaning into a typical blues rock affair of the era, albeit better than the average one. It's just my opinion, and probably the reason why I don't think of the whole album as being a complete masterpiece, but what am I going to say that will dethrone this album for the annals of rock history? The other 4 tracks are amazing tunes that I absolutely love, and ultimately Pink Floyd certainly delivered a perfect follow-up to their magnum opus. I will also say that this album has probably been the one that's grown on me the most during my Pink Floyd listening experience these past few months. I feel like I really resonate with the music and the themes a lot, and come to really understand the album's theme of absence the older I get. Hell yeah. I think I want to start by saying I've consistently enjoyed this album over the years. There's nothing I don't like about it. It's a perfect album in my books. The absolute animalistic, pardon the pun, nature of David Gilmour's guitar solos, Roger's cutthroat lyrical cynicism, Rick's beautiful textures, and Nick Mason's absolute monster groove. This album to me is one of their finest. Dogs may be one of my all-time favorite songs ever. I recently saw a video of Brad Taste in Music reacting to the album, and when I heard the opening fade with those stereo synths that creep in going back and forth on the left and right channels, I could just feel myself having the biggest grin on my face. The album is nostalgic to me for sure, but it's also just so right. Everything about it, the choices and chords, the structure, and the arrangement are just simply perfect. Pigs, 3 different ones, and Sheep are quite fantastic too. Pigs starts off in a somewhat tense way that erupts into the verses. Roger's scathing attacks on the 3 figures in the song do not hold any punches. In a way though, I feel like the song is just a very slow build for David to shine at the end of the track, where he lays down one of his most intensely menacing solos in the entire Pink Floyd catalog. Sheep is also brilliant. Rick's cool Rhodes solo eases us into the synth vocal crossfade that is just so sonically satisfying. Again, David's guitar in the outro is the highlight for me, where the guitars sound so immensely triumphant. Oh, by the way, if you haven't heard the latest Animals remix that dropped a few years ago, I highly recommend you take a listen. I never really considered any Pink Floyd album, let alone Animals, needing a remix, but after listening to it, I don't know if I could ever go back to the original. The new remix opens up the sound and allows each element of the mix breathing space. The best way I can think to describe it is where the original sounds kind of flat, this new album can be heard in 3 dimensions. One of the most striking changes I noticed was the bass guitar in Pigs. It's so much more present in the mix, it really thumps and grooves and is so incredibly funky. There are a few subtle changes I do wish they kept the same as the original, but I think it's really hard to beat the overall increase in sound quality that went into this release. My only gripe about it is now I just wish I could hear every great Pink Floyd album remixed in this fashion. Who knows, maybe now that the catalog has been bought out by Sony, we can remain hopeful of things to come. Ah yes, The Wall. I love this album. I have consistently enjoyed it over the years as one of my favorite Pink Floyd albums, and I've probably even said on numerous occasions that it was my favorite album. It has a great and relatable narrative, and despite being one of Pink Floyd's darkest works, it has remained a very pleasant and constant listening experience in my life that I love to revisit every once in a while. Let's start with some of the tracks, because there are quite a few. The big single, Another Brick in the Wall Part 2, might be overplayed to hell, but it's perfect. It's funky, it grooves, and despite the heavy disco influence, it's so obviously Floyd. Mother is one of my favorites. It's just a simple folky tune, but as always, David's solos shine through. Nobody Home has been a favorite of mine as well, but I think when listening to this album this past cycle, my overall favorite was Hey You. It's super depressing, but I think it's a really great track. From a calm brooding to an explosive solo to a general resignation of hopelessness, I think it's a perfect representation of what loneliness feels like. Run Like Hell is a track I sometimes forget about, and then I wonder why I forget about it because it's one of the first songs that I needed a delay pedal to learn. It's certainly one of my favorites on the album as well. Last but not least, Comfortably Numb is just the definitive Pink Floyd song in my opinion. The verses are cold but calculated, the chorus is vibrant, the guitar solos are blessed by God himself. I actually remember sitting down one day and learning the second solo on this song, just thinking how much of a power trip it felt like to play. The climax of this track has so much soulful emotion that feels amazing to get out in guitar form. I think this is an album that is at its strongest the way it was intended, in its complete form from front to back. When you start to pick apart individual tracks, the album seems a bit weaker. Some songs just seem to bridge the gap from one captivating moment to the next. But you have to kind of think about it like a musical, because it basically is a musical. It's an opera. You can't have Conrad Birdie introduce himself to the audience in one number, and then immediately afterwards he's getting punched in the face live on national television. There's narrative cohesion that takes place, and the other lesser-known tracks exist to build on your emotions and prepare you for the next big number. It's classic, and I wouldn't want a single thing omitted from the album. It's a masterpiece and certainly one of Pink Floyd's greatest achievements. Whenever I start to get tired of hearing this album in particular, I'll put on the live version, Is There Anybody Out There, from 1980 to 1981 instead. To my ears, it's a nice way to still experience the album without overindulging into the original to the point I grow tired of it. And compared to the original, this recording feels fresh, but still retains the nuance and finer details of its studio counterpart. It's a phenomenal recording in both sound quality and it just being a very complete presentation of The Wall, with extended cuts of some of the original songs and brand new inclusions like What Shall We Do Now and The Last Few Bricks, songs that were left off the main album. Moreover, it just sounds like the band's having a lot of fun, despite all the turmoil they were going through in this era. It's definitely one of my favorite live albums ever, and I highly recommend you check it out. Look, I'm not going to mince words here. I didn't like this one. Let's start with some favorite tracks. I think my only favorite track on this album was Not Now John, and that's partially because Gilmour helped write and sing on it. I've always felt like Pink Floyd were at their creative peak when everyone could get along, and perhaps that partially contributed to my opinion of this album. In fact, the parts I really enjoyed on this album were anytime David Gilmour was featured, partially because it provided a nice contrast to Roger's dominance on the album. It was these sections on the album that I felt encapsulated the Pink Floyd sound as best as this project could. The overly orchestrated, operatic parts feel far removed from what I recognize as Pink Floyd. The thoughtful keyboard parts or the lush textures that lay the foundations of their previous albums are completely absent on this record. As far as the others, the title track and the guitar solo on The Gunner's Dream are good, but I just never really clicked with the album as a whole. Moving on to the music production aspect, I don't know if this is really a complaint that anyone has ever voiced about the final cut, but I feel like the album is really quiet in the quiet parts and deafeningly loud in the loud parts. I don't know if this was done on purpose to make me turn up the volume, only for the music to hit harder and cause severe hearing loss, but I feel like I had to constantly turn up and down the volume when I listened to this album, which was kind of annoying. The lyrics are my last main issue with this album. They're clearly highly personal to Roger, but as a listener, it kind of makes me uncomfortable. It doesn't really invite you into a space where you can interpret the lyrics how you want or relate to them in any way. It just feels extremely claustrophobic, and as a listener, I don't really feel like I'm meant to relate or given the opportunity to try to understand. I feel like I'm being sung at, like there's a target on my chest if I'm not meant to enjoy what I'm listening to. As for overall judgment, this album is almost as bad as Ummagumma for me. In some ways, I feel like it's worse. So I sat down, I put on this album, the opening track Signs of Life comes on, and I am greeted with this rich sonic space with lush synths. This purposeful guitar line comes in, and I feel like I'm about to transcend into possibly one of the greatest comeback albums of all time. And then it was all downhill from there. I've already gone on the record saying I'm not really a big fan of this album. When I first listened to it, I just felt like it was the most 80s sounding thing I ever heard. It's kind of almost laughably so in some parts. Whereas Dick Perry's sax solos on previous albums had a certain level of sophistication and restraint to them, I feel like the sax solos on this record are so gaudy and cheesy that I can't take them seriously in any capacity. I think sonically this album sounds great, and the textures on this album are fantastic, but the songs themselves are just kind of uninteresting overall. There's certainly highlights here and there. I particularly enjoyed Signs of Life, One Slip, and Terminal Frost to some extent, but it's hard to treat my enjoyment of the music on the same level as the great Floyd albums of yesteryear. Overall, Momentary Lapse feels like a decent album, but nothing stuck in my brain after I finished listening to it. It feels like my memory gets wiped every time I hear it. On a positive note, I feel like the performances on this record are great, everyone plays wonderfully, and David's guitar solos have never been as grand as they have on some of these tracks. I just feel like musically it's not all quite there. And I know there's a remix version of this album that has improved drum sounds, but I don't necessarily feel like the drum sounds were the main issue I had with this album. I will say I don't think it's as bad as the final cut, but I also believe that this album's problems are fundamentally different from the problems of the final cut. Look, I know these post-Wall albums aren't that great, but we just gotta power through them, alright? I used to enjoy this album a lot when I was in high school because I actually had a CD copy of it that my friend burned for me that I listened to often. Unfortunately, my takeaway with this one was similar to a momentary lapse of reason, but I did enjoy it more, maybe because of nostalgia. I will say the sonics on this record are tremendous. I truly do believe this is one of the best sounding Pink Floyd albums in terms of production. Another thing I feel like was really good that was lacking on a momentary lapse is the overall concept of communication. Just having some sort of overall concept in general elevates the album a bit in my personal opinion. At the very least, it feels a bit more unified and put together than its predecessor, but when you start to dive deeper into the album, it does get a bit boring at times. I do like Marooned, Pulls Apart, A Great Day for Freedom, and High Hopes, but I think some of the other ones have the momentary lapse problem where they just kind of go in one ear and out the other. I remember talking to my dad about this album, and the way I explained it to him was, Dark Side of the Moon has a whopping 3 total guitar solos on it. Time, Money, and Any Color You Like. But Division Bell, I think it has like 7 or 8. And as much as I do love David Gilmour and the sound of his guitar and his technical ability, I can only take so many solos before I start to ask myself, was this really necessary? Overall, I think the album is an improvement over a momentary lapse, but not by any grand amount. I will probably revisit this album as a whole once in a while, but if not, I'll just stick to the picks that I pointed out. Is it finally nap time? Alright. I'll be honest, I didn't listen to this album for years after it dropped. I did have a phase where I just didn't listen to Pink Floyd at all really for years, and it just happened to drop during that phase where I wasn't really excited about anything Pink Floyd related. But after putting it off for so long, I decided I had to finish my listening experience off with a bang. More like a whimper. This album can be thought of as broken up into 4 separate sides, so let me just tackle it one side at a time. The first side starts out like a mix of Shine On You Crazy Diamond, Signs of Life, and Marooned. I kinda liked it, the ambient qualities were quite nice, and David's soloing is fantastic as always. I do feel like it drags a bit though as time goes on. Side 2 begins in a similar fashion that Keep Talking from Division Bell begins, which again is interesting as you ease into it, but it doesn't really quite evolve into anything more than a guitar solo over some pretty sounding synths. The next section goes into a brief Saucerful of Secrets-esque rhythmic drum section, compliments to Nick Mason, but it's just hard to be fully captivated by an old idea that again ends as soon as it starts. And then towards the end of this side we get some of that momentary lapse 80s cheesiness with that gaudy sax solo. Like this thing came out in 2014 but drop into the 80s and it would just sound perfect. You know what this section sounds like? It's very reminiscent of Maroon from Division Bell. Big surprise. They should have just called this Maroon the album and advertised it as, hey, you like Maroon? Well, we did that for a whole album. It's moderately okay. It's like the more the album goes on, the more I wonder why it wasn't just included on some super deluxe box set of the Division Bell. Like there are some ideas there and some genuinely interesting bits, but it feels more like a jam session than an album where people actually sat down and arranged and noted sections and things like that. There's nothing wrong with listening to a jam session, but I generally feel like a lot of the time the fun is the jamming itself as a musician, not necessarily hearing the jam as a listener. But I digress. Side 3 begins somewhat like side 1, which of course I know does not help me keep track of what's what when I wrote the script. Instead, I just opted to type this whole thing out as I listened to it, track by track, because I know I don't have the attention span to sit through this album on multiple listens to glean every detail about it. I will say, so far, this actually might be my favorite side. The instrumentals have some interesting chord progressions and arrangements, but again, I just wish that we could hear them as full, fleshed out tracks. As for side 4, honestly, I kinda hated it. After getting through the other sides, this just kinda sounded like some generic movie soundtrack trying too hard to pull on my heartstrings. Likewise, the track Louder Than Words is just whatever. I don't think I will ever want to revisit this song for as long as I live. Now, all that said, you might be shocked to hear this, but I must admit, going into this album, I wasn't really excited for it at all. Even less so when I read that David Gilmour said that the label forced him to release it. It honestly made me purposefully not want to listen to it, because to me, there's nothing worse than an artist putting out a subpar work to appease some money-hungry label executive. But I guess now that I'm coming away from this album, it wasn't as nearly as bad as I thought it was going to be. Obviously, being leftovers from the Division Bell makes it sound sonically great, and I think some of its ambient qualities and certain tracks here and there were interesting. It just didn't excite me in the same way that other Pink Floyd albums do. I can see it as an album that I might put on when I clean my room or something as pleasant background ambiance, but overall I probably will hardly ever come back to this one. Oh yeah, I forgot about this single. It's fine. I think the intent and message behind it kind of overshadow the music itself. Production-wise, it feels a bit more stripped back than the last 3 Floyd albums, and the music is nice, but I mean, I don't think it's necessary to do a very deep analysis or critique of this song in any capacity. It was very thoughtful of David to get the band back together and create this track as a goodwill gesture towards helping the people of Ukraine, and I do go back and listen to it every once in a while and actually enjoy it. Oh my god, it's finally over. Thank you for watching. Please leave suggestions and thoughts about this video or things you would like to see in future videos in the comments below. As always, you can support me on Ko-Fi as well as check out some of my original music on Bandcamp, Spotify, Apple Music, and right here on YouTube. Also, if you'd like to see more content like this, please let me know in the comments below. I really enjoyed making this video and just kind of going through all the albums and stuff. It was really an enjoyable experience for me to revisit this band that I love, so if you really liked it, then just let me know. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.